John Reed has been an affiliate for with ECC for a couple years. He kindly offered to share some insight. He wrote a book called Pinpointing Excellence, The Key to Finding a Quality Executive Coach. So he's done some study and research and put together some great thought leadership around the coaching industry, how businesses should think about coaching, and actually he has provided some insight onto how to choose coaches. So with that said, and he is aligned with, as you can see from the slide, many top-end organizations. We are just thrilled beyond measure to have him as one of our affiliates. And I'm going to hand things over to John so he can share a bit about his learning. And by the way, in 2018-19, John had made mention that he's going to have a follow-up to his book. So we want to keep our eyes out on that, and hopefully he'll come back and share that with us. So with that said, John, thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing your overview.
Thank you very much, Susan, and great to be here with you guys. And Olga, I want you to know that as an old college swimmer from feels like 100 years ago, I'm going to come down. I'd like to try out your pool at some point. So I appreciate this opportunity to converse with you guys, and so we can learn together. The major topic here, which I know becomes more and more important to people every year, is professional quality standards in executive coaching and how to raise them. So let me just jump in pretty quickly. I think I have about 15 minutes, and then we have plenty of time for questions and discussion after that. But want to just take a second to talk about how this topic sort of got on my radar, because my guess is similar things have happened to you guys. Talk for a second about the important role of buyers and decision makers in strengthening professional standards. How best to equip and prepare buyers and decision makers to do that. A couple of observations about the industry, and I'm sure you all have many as well, but a couple of things that are pleasing to me and a couple of things that are a little disturbing to me. And then again, plenty of time for comments, Q&A, and I'd also like to say that after this webinar, down the line, if anybody would like to converse about this topic, I'm very interested to do that and to learn from everybody. So very quickly, and again, maybe you guys have had similar experiences. About 20 years ago, I was wrapping up at the University of Georgia, getting trained as an organizational psychologist and executive coach, and starting in the strategy consulting practice at Accenture, doing maybe 5–10% of my time what was called executive counseling, executive therapy, executive coaching, had a lot of different names, but mostly strategy consulting, and that's sort of flipped now. But one of the first things I realized, I at that point had been to business school and was a licensed psychologist, is that people who were involved in this thing called executive coaching, I'm trying to think of the most tactful way to say this, had interesting but somewhat confusing qualifications, if any. And I thought, gosh, this is confusing. Maybe the field just hasn't had a chance to sort of stabilize itself and organize itself to set some real standards. And then it took about 10 years for me to realize that the field was a long way from actually doing that for a whole bunch of reasons. So I tried to think about how I might be able to help, just as an individual, raise quality standards. And that led to releasing this book about 6 years ago, which is basically just a buyer's guide, a guide to vetting and evaluating people who say they are an executive coach. So that's sort of the backdrop for this. So again, the discovery for me was that the industry seemed to be either unable or unwilling to organize itself, to set entry requirements, educational requirements, continuing educational requirements, just sort of the basics. That seems to be continuing. The industry, depending upon who you speak to, is anywhere from 40 to 50 years old, and this is continuing. The idea of helping executive coaches start to pay attention, be incentivized to pay attention to their own qualifications and education is important. I think that the best way to do that is to have buyers and decision makers setting higher expectations, and to do that, preparing buyers to set those expectations. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. It was released about 6 years ago, and the idea was to then take 7 or 8 years to observe what was happening in the field. Hence the follow-on book that hopefully is planned for 2018, 2019. But the premise of this book is just simply that consumers can be alerted and guided to improve professional service quality in executive coaching. I think personally those quality standards need to be raised so that executive coaching is sustainable, because as you guys know, more and more discussion is coming up around ROI and professional quality. So unless we sort of get organized, well, let's just say it'll be important to get organized. Buyers are continually somewhat confused, challenged to know what standards and criteria to use in this disorganized, unregulated, fragmented market. So I hear from many who are unfortunately vulnerable or have been the receptors of service that is just, let's just say, less than spellbinding, okay? Also, you guys have probably seen my assistant spends a good part of every day going through my email box and cleaning out the emails that come in huge quantities from people who are now promoting services to executive coaches on how to sell their services, right? How to market, how to pitch, how to position. I'm a former marketing strategy consultant, so I certainly get that marketing is important. But what I wish I saw more of was an emphasis on getting rigorously trained to actually deliver excellent service, right? So I think more and more coaches focusing more and more on selling without a commensurate focus on training makes it very important for buyers and decision makers to protect themselves and to be discriminating. So that's what this book tries to encourage. So very quickly, the sort of the basics in the book are that there are, everybody knows this, there's sort of 4 foundational elements of strong service in executive coaching. Nobody really takes issue with this, but if you're an executive coach, very important to have some degree of business education and business training for a whole host of reasons, but first and foremost to have some credibility with clients. Secondly, executive coaching is an area, a realm of behavior change, adult development, neuropsychology, a whole range of things. So having some psychological underpinnings, also very important. Important to have an ethics code that you adhere to. I think given the amount of money that gets spent on executive coaching, it's critical that people know that this service is conducted ethically. And then lastly, coaching training, coaching education, coaching certification. That area in and of itself, as you guys know, is somewhat confusing, somewhat vague, but it's important to have a good foundation there. Once buyers have satisfied themselves that the executive coach in front of them is solid in those areas, then the next thing the book tries to do is just help buyers assess this dimension of chemistry with the coach. And that, of course, is very important. Just like bedside manner is very important with a physician, right? However, I hear from people from time to time who say, gee, I was feeling very good with this coach. The chemistry was great. I wish I had looked under the covers a little more closely at what their actual training and education was. I had assumed that the corporate HR department who put this person in front of me had rigorously vetted that person. And in some cases that happens, in some cases it doesn't. So what we want to do is try and help people from being in that situation where the tail is wagging the dog, so to speak. Okay, so one of the things, the book has a lot of detail in it, but just one of the things we like to put out to help people are just some clarifying questions, just a handful of clarifying and clearing questions that they should be sure to ask and understand in anybody that they're looking at as a coach. So very quickly, first, what is your education and training as a leader, manager, executive, so on and so forth, right? Do you have an MBA? From what quality of program does your MBA come? What leadership roles have you held and for how many years? And so on and so forth. What's your education and training in psychology or a related behavioral science, social work, psychiatry, right? Do you have a doctorate? Are you licensed or board certified? What is your depth, practically speaking, in behavior change, neuropsych, adult development, executive assessment, so on and so forth? What ethics codes do you follow? How has this impacted your client work, right? How many documented hours of executive coaching experience do you actually have? What organizations have certified you and at what level, right? So some organizations, and I'm a member of ICF. ICF promotes what you might think of as a general coaching model for life coaches and a myriad of different coaches, not something that's specific to executive coaching, but fairly solid, right? ICF certification, for example, there are lots of different levels. As you can see, there are minimum requirements for ACC, PCC, and MCC, right? So I think that you could sort of bottom line this to say that consumers who simply take the claim that I'm a certified executive coach at face value need to do a little more digging, a little more research. And I still hear from people who actually never got around to confirming that the executive coach in front of them actually was certified. I know that's hard for people to believe, but that still happens. So, a couple of things, I think we all know this, but the buyers and decision makers, certainly in some cases, are individual executives who are seeking coaching service. But to a large extent, the buyers and decision makers to begin with are corporate HR and talent management departments who do their own vetting and determine who to have in their community of available coaches to then put forward as candidates to individual coachees, right? You know that. And then coaching supplier organizations like ECC, CoachSource, Right, so on and so forth, who determine who to put in their community of coaches to then put in front of corporate clients and coachees. All very good. However, there's an enormous variation in the criteria that these different entities use in vetting coaches, right? And so as a sort of as an end user, as the executive who's going to receive coaching, many are somewhat confused because they assume that HR professionals or coaching supplier organizations have rigorously screened candidates. ECC, I'm sure, does a very good job of that. I wish everybody did. The truth is, everybody does not. So that's, again, why equipping consumers to protect themselves and make good choices is so important. The scope of this situation is growing. I think we all know that, but just these statistics are from the ICF. I think they are understating the scope of things somewhat, but let's just take for a second the number of coaches worldwide. According to the ICF, over the last 4 years, 2012 to 2016, it's grown by about 12%. There are now in excess of 53,000 coaches globally, and I think that number is small, is understated. I don't know how many of those folks are executive coaches. I haven't been able to locate that information. If any of you guys happen to know what that number is or what the estimate is, I'd love to know it. Also, the number of coaching organizations just in the last 2 years has grown by 60% almost, right? So what that means to me is an increasing number of individual coaches and an increasing number of coaching organizations, all lacking consistent criteria to apply, right? Now, some good things that at least I'm seeing in the industry are very, very strong education and training programs from, for example, ECC, from the Institute of Coaching at McLean Harvard. Some of you may know of Judith Glazier and her program of conversational intelligence. I was lucky last year to be in the first group of people to be certified in that. That builds on neuropsychology. And again, anybody who says that they're a licensed psychologist, by the way, has had neuropsych training, and the licensure exam that they have to pass has a good component of neuropsych in it. So I'm a fan of Judith's program. There is the concern that I'm seeing is that sort of anecdotal information showing that there's this huge emphasis on sales and marketing of coaching services. I wish there were more emphasis on, again, a strong underpinning of training to deliver coaching services. Okay, that's a very quick run through. This is contact information, which I would be, again, I would be delighted to visit with you guys at any time. And a couple of, for Q&A, just a couple of maybe thought starters for us, but depending upon how you view it, if executive coaching has been around for close to a half a century and it's still not organized, how much longer do we think it will be, if ever, before there are uniform and strong professional standards? And then what can we all be doing to raise professional quality standards as individual coachees, that is consumers, corporate HR departments, coaching supplier organizations, or us as executive coaches? Okay, so that we've sort of breezed through that, but Leslie, if we're still able to take 5 minutes or so for Q&A, would love to do that.
Absolutely.
John, this is Agnes. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's always felt to me like we came to this profession from two different strands by and large, either from business and lacking foundations in psychological and behavior change approaches, or from therapy and not knowing the first thing about organizations. So that's actually the conundrum, and that's what actually makes the profession also quite exciting. And what I see from the buyer side is that people will prefer one or the other of those strands. So they'll select a coach who is a bit more solid in therapy, in a therapeutic background perhaps versus business, or they'll select someone who has more of a business background versus, and I think that's legitimate. I doubt that in our lifetime we're going to all get well-rounded enough in those 4 very critical areas that you mentioned. But I don't know if you've noticed that, but I mean, I interview against most of the people on the screen all the time, right? And I can tell that clients kind of go have a preference towards one or the other. The other 2 are not negotiable. You need to know how to coach, and you need to have an adherence to a code of ethics. But these 2 preferences I see in the market, and I was wondering if you noticed it in speaking with buyers.
Thank you, Agnes. That's a great observation. Having gone to business school and worked for 12 years prior to going back to school to be trained as a psychologist, I sort of get it from both directions. I think psychology is an excellent tool, but I'm fundamentally an executive. I do think that there are those 2 camps, but that the best way to begin to drive the industry so that people are well versed in both those areas will be by consumers, because as you say, I'm with psychologists all the time that say, oh, good God, I know everything about people. Why do I need to know anything about business? And I'm with executives all the time who say, hey, I get what's going on with executives. All this psychobabble stuff, good Lord, that's just not relevant, So I don't think either is adequate. And I think we need to sort of start to integrate those things. That's just a personal opinion.
I have a question for John.
Christian, do you
Yes,
have a
the question
question?
is,
Okay, great.
there is an overlap often there's an overlap between coaching and other activities that executives will either undergo themselves or need from other people. Do you have any indication of what's the ratio of executive coaches who are doing nothing but executive coaches? In other words, who are not offering mentoring or other lateral.
Yeah, Christian, I wish, I'm very interested to know that. I just have a general sense. Most of the people who come from the sort of the business side do a combination of coaching and mentoring, sometimes without really being able to distinguish between those 2 things. And people who come from the psychological side, particularly if they're organizational psychologists, are doing coaching, but they're also doing change management, organizational development, things like that. But that's just that's a general feeling. I don't have any research behind that. I'd love to talk with you more if perhaps I could learn more about that.
This is interesting because some of the organizations like ICF, who are trying to promote some general principles and some rules, and are focused on coaching and nothing but. And it's only occasionally that there is this understanding that coaching is rarely practiced as a pure coaching. It's sort of always mixed in a cocktail with other things. So the concept of the specialist executive coach is one. Could
I just quickly comment on that, Christian? probably like many of you, I'm trying to think, I have a little less than 4,000 sort of documented hours. So I'm contemplating going through the process of qualifying for an MCC with ICF, because you can do that at 2,500 hours. However, if you go through that process, you'll learn that you have to submit 2 recordings of sessions, and you are, according to their standards, if there's even a hint in those sessions of you giving advice or joining in problem solving, right, you don't qualify. And in 20 some odd years, being paid what we are paid, if all I did was sort of feedback to a CEO who said, gee, I'm very stressed about blah, blah, blah. And if I just said, Dave, you seem very stressed, that would be the end of the coaching relationship, right? So I have never had a coaching session that didn't call for joint problem solving, some degree of at least being a sounding board, if not being an advice giver. So I think ICF's approach to this in relation to what executive coaches actually do is needs to be more flexible. That's just an opinion.
Perhaps it is more flexible than you just reflected.
Maybe so.
I am myself an assessor for the ICF,
Oh.
so I think it's a little bit more flexible. But it remains an issue of knowing where the boundaries
Well,
are.
I'd love to maybe.
If we want to set boundaries, because I think executive coaching requires, as you justly evidenced, a broader set of capabilities or talents than perhaps strictly pure coaching.
Maybe I could get some coaching from you, Christian.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, Christian and I struggle with that in our assessing, but the fact is that when you think of where the profession came from, we were tending to advise too much. And I think the ICF came in at a moment where it was trying to create a collaborative and more sort of listening and exploratory conversation pattern. It's not saying that your practice has to be exclusively run that way, but it's attempting to teach even consultants to take a coach approach that's more exploratory. That's how I've arranged it in my mind, and that's how I approach the rigidity that you mentioned.
But I think, John, I first of all want to thank you so much for your overview. We'll be interested in your next chapter, your next book that will be coming out in 2018-19. I also want to thank everybody who has participated on the call this morning, this evening. We appreciate all of you, and I hope and I believe that ECC is as strong as it is due to some of John's overview and insight, and most importantly, all of you and your amazing background.